Little secret. We ended up having to order a new connecting rod because the wrist pin side of it was pounded out. And this is a rush order. The customer has no air in a mechanic shop, and they're struggling by on a new electric impact I sold them until we can get this back to them. So instead of shooting this in episodes that we like to break down and do, we're doing this as we can do it, and I'm going to cut things together later because it's more important to get the customer back running as soon as possible than it is for me to wait till tomorrow when we have another connecting rod and do a full episode going, okay, we're going to do this now. So you saw the difficulty we had getting this connecting rod off and the other one because the 325s only have one hand hole and it's very difficult to get the rods loose. I pounded on the connecting rod bolts, but I used brass. I used a brass drift and a big hammer and was able to knock them apart. I've never had to turn a compressor upside down, not a Quincy anyway, to get these loose. Well, I worried and worried and worried, and look at that. That brass does not damage steel. Brass is softer than steel, and I hammered this apart, did no damage to the rod. Now, this rod, if the camera wife would zoom in closely, this rod has a lot of years on it, but it's a pressure-fed rod, and this rod is the low pressure side, and it actually gets a little bit more flow than the high pressure side because it's earlier than in the oil system. And when we put our connecting or our wrist pin through it, that is just as pretty of a fit. There is no play to it, nothing. And I could put a new bushing in this. We have the new bushing. I could put a new bushing in that. We could go to the machine shop. They could size it, make it fit, and it might be looser than this one that's 60 years old. So yes, we're putting a 60-year-old part, a wear part, back in this, but that's the advantage of your pressure-fed machine as opposed to splash lube. This is a Quincy. I've bragged about them before. The QR model series Quincy's are the best recips in the world, and I'm holding a connecting rod that's 60 years old with a brass bushing in it, and it is perfect. This is factory spec perfect. So I was cleaning parts and I decided to take this apart. Didn't show you how this came apart. This is different than other ones we've had on the show here, but we're going to slip this back in. This is a new wrist pin. The old wrist pin actually had some wear over the years. Can you zoom in on that?
As long as you hold
And
it still for me.
You can barely feel that.
But you can see.
You can see that.
Yeah.
This is to the same spec. This is the same OD, and it's got a fresh wear surface. And even with this in there, you can barely feel any movement. So I took it out without showing you because the camera wife wasn't here. She had something else to do. She doesn't run around every whim waiting on me hand and foot.
But it seems like it.
Yeah, you're a card. So we'll take the rings off. Now, there's two slots, and that can be this can be slightly manipulated by a screwdriver, but you have a hole right there, and that hole needs to line up with this hole. Did you get that?
I think so.
Okay. Ball peen. So we're going to take and straight, they go much nicer. I'm going to tap this a little further in. And I went too far. It's like the hook, this is wrist pin hokey pokey. So, that's a neater fit than I thought it was. So, we put our wrist pin in, so we put our connecting rod in, and I gotta, I can spin it around this way for you. Let's tap her in. Get that started onto the wrist pin. There we go. And here's where
Thank you.
we're slightly off where this hole is with this hole. If I keep going in, we're going to miss it slightly. I'm going to grab my screwdriver and I'm going to give this a very slight little twist. Just put a slot right there. Looks like it should go. Does that look nice and lined up, Bill?
Let's let them decide. We're supposed to be lining up that hole at the top, that little indent there with the hole. Looks pretty good.
Why, thank you, Bill. Let me tap that down a little. And see where we're at. And we missed it ever so slightly. This is a special screw.
All right. Yes.
The piston is threaded, and the bottom of the screw goes into the wrist pin. Here's the old wrist pin. So the bottom of the screw goes into the wrist pin, keeps the wrist pin from going anywhere. And so you screw this in, and then we take and put a cotter pin through there and bend it so even if it comes loose, it doesn't run out and fall into the crankcase and let this destroy the cylinder wall. So let's see if we're close enough. And I believe we are. Maybe we aren't. So turn that. There's the whisker. I'm going to tap it back out so I can turn it easy. Turn it just a whisker. When I say a whisker, that was the whisker. Let's tap her back in, see if where we need to be. Need to go a little further.
Oh, a little further in. Okay, I thought you meant turning it and you pounded it the wrong way.
Okay, all I need to do is put a cotter pin in there, and the wrist pin's reinstalled, the connecting rod's good to go, and we'll put rings on that in a little while. Had a little trouble lining it up, but got it in. And the wrist pin's in, the connecting rod's back in. We have to put some new rings on it. We'll do that when we do the high pressure side. Well, we've already got the low pressure side piston and wrist pin put back together. This one is different. There is no lock or keeper in the piston to keep this in place. However, they put these little aluminum buttons on each end of the wrist pin so that if it does slide out, it won't damage the iron in the cylinder wall. It may give you a little debris, but it is what it is. Now, we did push the new bushing into the old connecting rod on the low pressure side, and I said that was so nice and tight it'd be crazy. This is a factory rod from Quincy. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this is a factory rod from Quincy, and there is the slightest bit of movement there's no way you can feel or see it or even hear it, but there's the slightest bit of movement. This brand new rod is looser on the connecting rod bush, on the wrist pin bushing, than the 60-year-old rod was. But I'm going to trust Quincy and put her together. $500. I can get the same rod in Aftermarket for $180 plus a few shipping things, but $180 versus $500. The Aftermarket one is not available for another 20 days or so, and the customer has to have the compressor, and he authorized one OEM. OEM, $320 more. Call me when you need aftermarket parts. We will take care of you. So, very simply, we have the new piston, and I didn't even price the new piston out of Quincy because this is a $100 aftermarket piston. The old piston, the wrist pin had worn into the circle here where my finger is and had pounded that oblong. So we are replacing the piston and the wrist pin and the connecting rod all on the high side. So it's very simple. I already started the pin through, got it started into the rod, and a little tap. And that's ready to go. Infinitely tighter than the busted rod that came out of it. A little bit more that we're going to talk about the rods. Camera wipe, can you see right there and right there? On the top and bottom of this, these two halves for this circle, I told you the other day that if you know how it went together, you didn't have to mark them, but you have to keep the cap for the low pressure on the low pressure rod and the high pressure on the high pressure rod, because these are machined to match. The way you can tell which way this goes on this would be wrong, because you can see that little tab and you can see that little tab. Those tabs always go on the same side in these Quincy's. So even if I dropped this and went, gee, I wonder which way that goes, I know it goes this way because those two tabs are always on the same side.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Compressor Guru. Please hit like and subscribe and use the notify bell so you will know when the next new episode is released from The Compressor Guru. God bless you and have a great day.